Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, which, as you know, is now an ad-free zone. No need to sit there and wait to skip through those annoying advertisements at the beginning of any of my video postings. But one other announcement that we have to make just before we get down to business is that we've now passed that 19,000 subscribers total, and we are now on our way to that coveted 20,000 mark. So once again, thanks to everybody out there who watches my video content and continue to support my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel. Right, now it's been a few weeks or even months since we've posted a British classic here on my channel, so we're going to put that to rights right away here by taking a look at this next featured machine, which is Philip Whitham's 1967 Cotton Triumph 500. Now, if you're a regular visitor or even a subscriber to my CDB TV channel, then you may have come across another similar clip on this bike that I did some years ago, but it's such an interesting old classic, and apparently it's quite popular as well here on YouTube because a couple of my subscribers have asked if I could possibly do another revamp on this bike. And as I've got a couple of weeks free before I head off on my next classic adventure, I've decided to use that time to good effect and post this recycled version of this old school British classic. So essentially what we have here is Philip Whitham's 1967 Cotton Triumph Twin, a bike that's naturally made up of a cotton frame with a 500cc Triumph T100 twin cylinder motor in the chassis. But as you can see, it's a stunning little motorcycle, and in its way it's quite typical of one of the old school pre-1970 four-stroke scramblers that we used to watch back in the 1960s and 70s. That was just before the much lighter and nimbler two-stroke scramblers started to steal all the limelight from these heavier Triumph BSAs and many of the other big four-strokers like Matchless and HISs. But prior to Philip buying this classic, there have been quite a few notable riders who've owned or even raced this bike, with the great Brian Crosby being one of the big names that have been linked with this machine, and also a local rider called Bert Robinson, who was another name connected to this little Cotton Triumph. But apart from those aforementioned names, there was another racing legend who was familiar with this bike, and it was this man here, the Cheshire Charger himself, the great Pete Mathia, who it's said once raced this little Cotton Triumph at one time during his illustrious racing career. And in this picture here, you can see Pete pictured beside his old Works Cotton EMX racer that's just been recently restored. But there was also another big name linked with this Cotton Triumph's history, and it was this man here, the great Andy Roberton, who was another one of Britain's greatest scramblers in the 1960s and 70s, who rode Cottons at an early age as a works rider. And in fact, when Philip first bought this bike, Andy Roberton's signature, he said, was still emblazoned on the fuel tank. So not only is this little Triumph Cotton Twin a cracking looking bike, it's got some decent history behind it as well. But back in the 1960s, the word is that this bike here was built by a man called Ian Lewis, who it said worked for the late Fluff Brown, who, as you know, was the man who bought out all of the bikes, the parts and the rights to the highly successful HIS Stormer scramblers when the original HIS Motorcycles brand went down the toilet. So again, yet more history to add to this quite interesting British classic. But as I said, the frame of this bike is naturally a British-built cotton chassis, which was made from quite light gauge tubular steel, as of course many of the other cotton motorcycles were way back in the day. But cotton motorcycles were formed originally by Frank Willoughby Cotton way back in 1918, and like many of the other British motorcycle manufacturers of their time, they also had a sales slogan, and Cotton's was the motorcycle masterpiece. Now, as you may already know, these cotton chassis didn't have the engine oil stored in the frame like the other Rickmans and CCM frames did back in the 1960s and 70s, because our Cotton Triumph uses a conventional oil tank here on the right hand side of the frame that feeds that lubricant through the chrome covered oil filter there, and then around the engine and back into the oil tank. But generally these cotton frames were very well made, and certainly strong enough to take any kind of punishment that they'd come across on a British made racetrack. And just like many of the other British bike builders of that decade, you could fit a variety of different engines into your cotton frame, whether it be a single cylinder two-stroke or four-stroke, or in our case here, a big Triumph Twin 500. So these cottons, as you can gather, were not only popular, but they were highly versatile as well. Now, for me personally, I'm certainly no expert on these Triumph twin engines, because this was basically still a road bike motor, which, as I remember, I think was used on the Triumph Tiger back in the day, but it was just a parallel twin with the basic overhead valves, and I think it was a 4-speed gearbox as well, which also had a wet multi-plate clutch that was connected onto the crank by way of a duplex primary chain. Right, so it's on to our featured bike's engine, which is a twin-cylinder Triumph T100 500cc 4-stroke motor, which, as you can see, is a perfect size and fit for this lightweight cotton frame. Now, whether our particular 500 Triumph Twins had any engine work or modifications done on it, I don't actually know, because I was never furnished with that information on the day that I shot these clips. But if you're familiar with these T100 power plants, then you'll already know just how good they were, and perfectly suited for use as a 4-stroke scrambles motor. But I'm certainly no expert on these Triumph twin engines, because this was still essentially a road bike engine, which, as I remember, I think it was used on the Triumph Tiger way back in the day. But it certainly was a parallel twin with simple overhead valves, and I think it was a 4-speed gearbox as well, which also had a wet multi-plate clutch that was connected onto the crank by way of a duplex primary chain. Now, on the spark side of our T100, I'm pretty certain that back in the 1960s, this engine's ignition system would have probably have been the old points and condenser affairs, but as far as I know, this has now been converted to a much more efficient and more reliable Boyer electronic ignition. And as we move on to the fuel side of our 500 Triumph, it's fed by a single 28mm Amel concentric carburetor. But I think if you'd bought the road-going sports version of this 500 engine in the 1960s, which I think at the time was fitted into the Daytona sports bike. Then this engine would have been fed with a pair of twin Amal monoblock or concentric carbs. And also on that street road-going version of this engine, you would have had two header pipes leading onto a pair of twin tailpipes that ran down either side of the bike. But on this cotton scrambler, you can see that the two headers go into a single tailpipe and eventually join onto that quite nice short megaphone there at the rear, which, as I'm led to believe, was all built by classic dirt bike builder Rod Spry. But certainly later in this video we should be able to hear the sound that comes out of this Triumph exhaust system. Now, I have it on quite good authority that the gearbox on our T100 motor was all built using scrambles gearing instead of the stock standard road-going setup, and this was all engineered by Yorkshire's finest Triumph specialist, Howard Bainbridge. But moving swiftly on here, we head to the bike's front suspension, where we have a pair of Italian Seriani forks here at the front, which were very typical of the kind of suspensions that were being used on many of these British classics way back in that 1960s era, because let's face it, there wasn't really an awful lot of choice with regards picking a top-rated suspension system for your race bike at that time, and these Serianis were certainly considered about the best that you could get with the technology that was available. And also for 1967, it was old school drum brakes, which, like the front forks, were the motorcycle braking systems of their time. And because this was a fluff brown inspired build, it naturally used the front and rear hubs from the coveted HIS Stormer, of which, as you know, Fluff Brown now owned. But these vintage drum brakes were normally used to slow or stop a lightweight two-stroke race bike, so I'm not entirely sure how they'd cope with this much heavier Triumph Twin. But then again, I wouldn't think it would have been too much of a problem, because many of the big twin-cylinder road bikes of that day were all using similar braking systems to these that usually worked well enough. But staying here at the back wheel, you can see it was quite a substantial rear sprocket that was fitted onto our cotton Triumph, probably all proportionate to get the gearing absolutely right for the Triumph twin engine and gearbox. But this rear sprocket, as you can see, is held onto the hub by no fewer than 10 bolts, so there's not much chance of this sprocket coming loose on the hub. And this part, I'm led to believe, was made by the great Terry Weedy, who also manufactured replacement alloy fuel tanks for many British machines. And also in 1967, it would probably have been a pair of old school Girling dampers or something similar that would have been bolted onto this old cotton at that time. But thankfully, in these much more modern times, you can now improve the handling of your old classic with a variety of better replacements. And in Philip's case here, he's decided to go for a good pair of quality Falcon shocks to fit onto his race bike to replace the old basic dampers. But one of the more prominent features on our 67 Cotton Triumph is this quite nicely painted fiberglass fuel tank, of which many of the old cotton scramblers did use at that time, with of course their logo here on the side, the motorcycle masterpiece. But as I've said many times before with regards to these vintage fiberglass fuel tanks, they don't take too kindly to modern day fuels that tend to eat away at the insides of the tank if you leave fuel stored in them for long periods of time. But of course that's not a problem if you just simply drain the tank down when you're not using the bike at a race event. Although I must say it's still quite good to see these old timers with their stock original front and rear alloy mudguards, which, as you know, were widely used not just on these off-road bikes, but the 1960s road machines as well during that period. And naturally, these parts here weren't as tough as our modern day plastics, but when the likes of Preston Petty came along with his unbreakable plastic fenders in the 1970s, it certainly made quite an impact in off-road racing, and the days of these old school aluminium mudguards were beginning to be numbered. Now, just about the only part on Philip's cotton that's not original are these rental handlebars, which have more than likely just been changed to get the correct riding position for Philip's stature and riding style. And I can see that he's also added an engine kill switch there as well, just as a little safeguard should anything go wrong with that T100 engine and it needs to be shut down in a hurry. But I must say, for me personally speaking, I've always liked this British built cotton Triumph of Philip's ever since I first came across it here at Drumlandrig Castle, which was back in 2017. And I don't actually know what the appeal is of this bike, whether it's that nicely painted fiberglass fuel tank or maybe the Triumph Twin motor, but I think it's just a combination of all of the parts, including the wheels and the rear shocks and the chassis and the general finish of the complete bike that makes it all just stand out. But you also have to remember this bike's history and the legendary riders like Pete Mathia and Andy Roberton, who rode this bike during their career. So not only has Philip got himself a stunning little classic, he's also got himself a piece of scrambling history as well. And the other pluses that he's still racing this bike at classic and vintage race events even to this day. Right, okay, so we've had a quick look around the bike and we've talked a little about its sum of parts. So let's have a quick listen in and hear what she actually sounds like.